There is a place in Kaliningrad where the hallways still smell like iodine and wet concrete. Where the paint on the walls has not peeled so much as wept, sliding down in long, jaundiced ribbons that pool along the baseboards like shed skin. Where every door is open except the ones that matter. And in the basement of this place, behind a steel door that someone sealed with a padlock from the outside, a group of Polish urban explorers found a room full of filing cabinets. Hundreds of patient records. Neatly organized. Carefully maintained. As if someone had intended to come back for them. Most of the files are what you would expect from a Soviet-era psychiatric institution: admission dates, discharge dates, diagnoses written in the clinical shorthand of a system that treated mental illness as something closer to political inconvenience than medical reality. Schizophrenia. Sluggish schizophrenia. Paranoid delusions incompatible with socialist reality. The language is cold, bureaucratic, and deeply familiar to anyone who has studied the history of Soviet psychiatry. But then there are the other files. 47 of them, to be exact. These files have no admission dates. They have no discharge dates. The patients listed within them do not appear in any known census, not Soviet, not Russian, not Polish, not Lithuanian. Their names, if they are real names, return nothing. No birth records. No death records. No evidence that these people existed in any capacity outside of this one basement room in an abandoned building on the outskirts of a city that itself exists in a kind of geopolitical liminal space. Each of these 47 files is stamped with a project codename. In Russian, it reads. In English, it translates, roughly, to the severing. And the contents of these files describe procedures that have no equivalent in any known psychiatric literature. Not because they are advanced. But because they appear to have been designed to do something to the human mind that no ethical framework, no scientific framework, has a name for. This is the story of what was found in Kaliningrad. And I want to be very careful with how I tell it. Because the people who found it have not been the same since. Let me start with the explorers themselves. The group calls themselves Zapomniane Miejsca, Forgotten Places. They are, or were, a 5-person urban exploration collective based out of Gdansk, Poland. They are not amateurs. Their YouTube channel, which at the time of these events had roughly 12,000 subscribers, featured well-produced documentation of abandoned hospitals, Soviet military installations, decommissioned factories, and the occasional forgotten residential block across Poland, Lithuania, and the wider Baltic region. Their content was methodical. Educational, even. They wore proper safety equipment. They researched locations before entering. They had a particular interest in Soviet-era infrastructure, not for sensationalism, but because several members had family histories intertwined with the Soviet occupation of Poland. For them, these explorations were acts of remembrance. Of confrontation. In the spring of 2019, they turned their attention to Kaliningrad. For those unfamiliar, Kaliningrad is Russia's westernmost territory, a small oblast wedged between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic Sea, physically separated from the rest of Russia. Before 1945, it was Königsberg, a major Prussian and then German city. After World War II, the Soviets expelled the German population and resettled the region with Soviet citizens. The result is a place of layered identity, German architecture beneath Soviet concrete, beneath post-Soviet neglect, beneath modern Russian nationalism. It is a city where history does not so much accumulate as collapse in on itself. It is also a place where certain kinds of Soviet infrastructure were built far from Moscow's direct oversight. The facility that concerns us was located approximately 14 kilometers southeast of the city center, in a wooded area that, according to the group's preliminary research, had once been part of a larger Soviet military medical complex. Satellite imagery showed a cluster of buildings, most of them visibly deteriorated, surrounded by a perimeter wall that had partially collapsed. Local forums referenced the site obliquely, with the kind of vague warnings that urban explorers learn to read as invitations: not worth the trip, nothing there, stay away. The absence of detailed information was, itself, information. The group entered Russia on tourist visas in April of 2019. They spent 3 days in Kaliningrad proper, documenting other locations and, according to later interviews, gathering local intelligence about the psychiatric facility. What they learned was fragmentary. An elderly woman at a market told one member that the facility had been for soldiers who came back wrong. A taxi driver claimed it had been closed since the late 1980s, though he could not say exactly when or why. A librarian at the regional archive said she had no records of the facility at all and suggested, politely, that they were mistaken about its existence. They reached the facility on the morning of April 17. The footage from that day, some of which was later uploaded in a heavily edited format before being removed, shows a compound of 6 buildings arranged in a rough horseshoe pattern around a central courtyard. The main building was 3 stories tall, constructed in the brutalist style common to Soviet institutional architecture of the 1960s. The windows on the upper floors were broken. The windows on the ground floor were bricked up. The group entered through a loading dock at the rear of the main building. The interior was in a state of advanced decay but not complete ruin. The hallways were intact. Many of the rooms still contained furniture, metal bed frames, examination tables, cabinets. There was graffiti in places, suggesting that others had been there before, but it was sparse and old. The dominant impression, according to the group's written account published months later, was one of interruption. As if the facility had not been decommissioned so much as evacuated. Drawers left open. Chairs pushed back from desks. A calendar on one wall showed March 1988. The first and second floors yielded the kind of material that experienced urban explorers know well. Patient wards with rows of iron beds. Treatment rooms with rusted equipment. Administrative offices with water-damaged paperwork. One room on the second floor contained a large chair with leather restraints, wrist, ankle, forehead, and chest, bolted to the floor in front of what appeared to be a projection screen. The group photographed it extensively but did not speculate about its purpose in their initial documentation. It was on the second floor that they found the staircase leading down. Not the main staircase, that only went from the ground floor to the upper levels. This was a secondary staircase, located behind a door in what appeared to be a storage room. The door was unmarked. The staircase descended to a basement level that was not visible from the exterior of the building and did not appear on any of the architectural plans the group had been able to locate during their research. The basement was different. The first thing they noted was the condition of the walls. Unlike the rest of the facility, where paint peeled and plaster crumbled, the basement walls were covered in tiles, white, institutional tiles, like those in a hospital operating theater or a morgue. Many were cracked, but they were intact enough to give the space a clinical quality that the upper floors had lost to decades of neglect. The floor was poured concrete, smooth and slightly graded toward drains set at regular intervals. The air was cold and still and carried that iodine smell I mentioned, sharp, chemical, underlaid with something organic that none of them could identify. There were 6 rooms in the basement. 4 of them were empty except for bolted-down furniture, chairs, tables, a single bed frame in each. The 5th room contained equipment that the group could not immediately identify, a series of metal cabinets with dials and switches, connected by heavy cabling to a chair similar to the one found upstairs, but more elaborate. This chair had additional restraints and what appeared to be a helmet or headpiece, a metal framework designed to immobilize the skull, with attachment points for electrodes or sensors. The group photographed this room extensively but touched nothing. The 6th room was locked. Not just locked, sealed. A heavy steel door, industrial grade, with a padlock on the outside. The padlock was substantial but old, and after some deliberation, the group forced it. This was, they later acknowledged, a violation of their usual practice of leaving locations undisturbed. But something about the basement, its condition, its concealment, the care that had been taken to preserve it, convinced them that whatever was behind that door had been deliberately hidden. Behind the door was a room roughly 4 meters by 6 meters. The walls were the same white tile. There was a metal desk and a chair. And along 3 of the 4 walls, floor to ceiling, were filing cabinets. Green metal filing cabinets. Soviet standard issue. Each drawer labeled with a range of numbers. Inside, hanging files. Inside those, patient records. The group spent approximately 3 hours in that room. They photographed everything they could. They did not remove any files, this is important, and they have been consistent on this point. They took photographs. Hundreds of photographs. Close-ups of individual pages, wide shots of the cabinets, detail shots of stamps and signatures and the typewritten text that filled each file. When they reviewed those photographs later, back in Gdansk, in the safety of a shared apartment, with a Russian-speaking colleague helping to translate, they began to understand what they had found. And that is when the story changes. The majority of the files, several hundred, were standard Soviet psychiatric records. Dense, bureaucratic, dehumanizing in the way that all such documents are, but standard. Patients admitted for various diagnoses, treated with various methods, discharged or transferred or, in some cases, deceased. The dates ranged from 1962 to 1988. The facility appeared to have been operational for approximately 26 years. But interspersed among these files, distributed across multiple cabinets without any apparent organizational logic, almost as if they had been deliberately scattered to avoid detection, were the other files. The 47. These files were visually distinct. They were printed on a slightly different paper stock, heavier, with a faintly blue tint. Each one bore a stamp in the upper right corner, a red circle containing the word and a string of numbers that appeared to be a project classification code. The format of the records was different as well. Where the standard files followed a template common to Soviet medical documentation, these files used a structure that none of the group's contacts, including 2 academic researchers with expertise in Soviet medical history, could identify. Let me describe what was in them. Each file contained a photograph. Black and white. Passport style. The subjects ranged in apparent age from late teens to perhaps mid-50s. Men and women. Their expressions were uniformly blank, not posed, not stoic, but empty in a way that is difficult to describe and deeply unsettling to look at. Several of the photographs showed subjects with shaved heads. A few showed visible scarring, at the temples, behind the ears, along the jawline. Below the photograph, a name. Or what appeared to be a name. Some were clearly Russian. Others were ambiguous, they could have been Russian, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, or Polish. A few appeared to be entirely fabricated, following no recognizable naming convention. Below the name, a series of fields. And this is where the files became truly anomalous. There was a field for date of admission. In every one of the 47 files, this field was blank. There was a field for date of discharge. Also blank. Every file. There was a field for diagnosis. This was not blank, but it did not contain any recognized psychiatric terminology. Instead, each file listed a series of codes, alphanumeric strings that did not correspond to any known Soviet diagnostic system. The group's academic contacts confirmed this. These codes appear in no published literature, no declassified documents, no archive materials. They are, as far as anyone has been able to determine, unique to this facility. There was a field labeled, in Russian, procedure status. The entries in this field varied. Some said, initiated. Some said, in progress. Some said, complete. A small number, 7, to be exact, said, irreversible. And there was a final field, at the bottom of the first page of each file. It was labeled, severance index. It contained a number, always between 0 and 10, expressed to 2 decimal places. The numbers ranged from 1.34 to 9.71. The group did not initially understand the significance of this number. But as they worked through the files, cross-referencing the severance index with the procedure status and the notes contained in the subsequent pages, a pattern emerged. The patients with lower severance index numbers had shorter files. Their notes were sparse, a few lines of clinical observation, references to sessions, with dates but no descriptions of what occurred during those sessions. These patients' procedure status was typically listed as initiated or in progress. The patients with higher numbers had longer files. Much longer. Pages and pages of densely typed notes describing behavioral observations, cognitive assessments, and something that was referred to repeatedly as integration metrics. These patients had undergone more sessions. Their files referenced specific equipment, designated by code numbers that matched labels the group had photographed on the machinery in the fifth basement room. And the clinical language used to describe these patients shifted in a way that every member of the group, even before the translation was complete, found profoundly disturbing. In the early entries, the patients were described as individuals. They had behaviors, reactions, preferences, resistances. They spoke. They protested. They asked questions. One patient, designated as Subject 31, was noted to have repeatedly requested information about the duration of the study. Another, Subject 14, exhibited persistent attachment to a personal item and became agitated when it was removed. In the later entries, these individual characteristics disappeared. The language became purely functional. Subject 31 no longer asked questions. Subject 14 no longer exhibited attachment to anything. The notes described patients who ate when food was provided, who slept when the lights were turned off, who sat in chairs and looked at walls and responded to direct commands but initiated nothing. They were described not as people who had been sedated or suppressed, but as people who had been, and this word appeared again and again in the files, severed. Severed from what? The files never stated explicitly. The clinical language is careful, technical, and operates from a framework of assumptions that the reader is apparently expected to share. But reading between the lines, and the group spent months doing exactly that, consulting with psychologists, linguists, and historians, a picture begins to emerge. The procedures described in these files were not designed to treat mental illness. They were not designed to punish dissidents, though the Soviet psychiatric system certainly did that elsewhere. They were designed to sever the connection between a human being and their sense of self. Their identity. Their continuity as a person who exists across time, who has a past, who anticipates a future, who experiences the present as someone in particular. The severing was not a lobotomy. The files reference electrical stimulation, pharmacological intervention, sensory deprivation, and prolonged sessions in the chair with the headpiece, but the goal was not to damage the brain in a crude, irreversible way. The goal, as far as can be interpreted from the clinical notes, was far more precise. It was to systematically dismantle the psychological structures that allow a person to experience themselves as a self. To strip away identity without stripping away function. To create a human being who could walk, speak, follow instructions, process information, but who had no interior experience of being anyone at all. Not unconscious. Not comatose. Not brain damaged. Awake. Functional. And utterly, completely empty. The 7 files marked irreversible describe patients who reached this state and could not be brought back from it. The notes on these patients are the shortest of all. Not because there was nothing to observe, but because there was nothing left to observe. The patients performed basic biological functions. They responded to stimuli. But the person who had once inhabited that body was, according to every metric the researchers applied, gone. Not dead. Not absent. Gone in a way that the files suggest the researchers themselves found difficult to categorize. One note, appended to the file of Subject 39, reads, "And I am translating as faithfully as the group's linguist was able, the subject continues to meet all physiological markers of life. Cognitive processing remains within normal parameters. However, the integrative center has been fully severed. There is no evidence of subjective experience. The question of whether the subject can be said to be alive in any meaningful sense is outside the scope of this project. Outside the scope of this project. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment. Because it tells us something not just about what was done in that facility but about the people who did it. They created a procedure that could erase a person's inner life, their consciousness, their self, whatever you want to call the thing that makes you you, and when confronted with the philosophical horror of what they had achieved, their response was to note it for the record and move on. It was outside the scope. The group from Gdansk did not move on. After returning to Poland, they spent the better part of a year trying to identify the 47 patients. They used the names from the files, or at least the names that appeared to be real, and searched every database they could access. Soviet census records. Lithuanian and Polish civil registries. Immigration records. Military records. University enrollment lists. Hospital records from other facilities. Nothing. Not a single one of the 47 patients appeared in any record, anywhere, outside of that basement room. It was as if they had never existed. As if they had been created solely for the purpose of being unmade. And this is where the investigation takes a turn that I find more unsettling than anything in the files themselves. Because the group began to ask a question that seems obvious in retrospect but carries implications that are difficult to sit with. If these patients had no identities before entering the facility, then what was being severed? One interpretation is bureaucratic. The Soviets were meticulous record keepers when they wanted to be and enthusiastic record destroyers when they needed to be. It is entirely possible that these patients were real people whose records were systematically erased from all other archives as a security measure. This would be consistent with known Soviet practices around classified projects. People could be made to disappear, not physically, but administratively. Their names removed from census rolls, their birth certificates pulled, their entire documented existence reduced to a single file in a locked room in a facility that was itself expunged from official records. This is the rational explanation. It is probably the correct one. But the group found evidence that complicates it. Among the notes in several of the files, particularly those with higher severance index numbers, there are references to what the researchers called baseline identity mapping. This was apparently a preliminary step in the procedure, conducted before any intervention began. The researchers would document the patient's sense of self in exhaustive detail, their memories, their emotional associations, their self-concept, their understanding of their own history. This mapping served as a kind of before picture against which the progress of the severing could be measured. In 3 of the 47 files, the baseline identity mapping section contains a single notation: no pre-existing identity structure detected. 3 patients who, before any procedure was performed, already had no self to sever. The implications of this are unclear. Perhaps they were patients who had already undergone severe psychological trauma. Perhaps they were individuals with pre-existing dissociative conditions. Perhaps the notation is an error. But the group's consulting psychologist offered another possibility, one that she described as professionally irresponsible to speculate about before speculating about it anyway. What if the project was not just about destroying identity? What if it was about understanding identity so thoroughly that it could be manufactured? What if the 3 patients with no baseline identity were not damaged people but blank ones, and what if they were blank because they had been created that way? Not born. Produced. Assembled from biological raw material into functional human forms that could walk and talk and pass every physiological test but that had never, at any point, experienced the interior sensation of being a person. She was clear that this was not her professional opinion. She was clear that she found the idea absurd. But she also noted that the files, taken at face value, were consistent with it. And she could not explain the 3 blank baselines any other way. Neither could anyone else. The group published their findings, the photographs, the translations, their analysis, on a dedicated website in early 2020. The timing was unfortunate. The world had other concerns. The site received modest attention from the urban exploration community and a small number of researchers interested in Soviet psychiatric history. Several people questioned the authenticity of the files. The group offered to share the original photographs at full resolution with any accredited researcher who requested them. A few did. None found evidence of fabrication. Then the site went down. Not gradually. Not through neglect. The domain registration was cancelled. The hosting account was closed. The group's YouTube channel, which had posted a single video summarizing the Kaliningrad exploration, carefully edited, with faces and certain identifying details obscured, was terminated for violations of community guidelines. The specific violation was never clarified. 2 members of the group stopped responding to messages. A third posted a brief statement on a Polish forum saying that they had been advised to discontinue their research and would not be commenting further. They did not say who had advised them. The statement was later deleted. The remaining 2 members, the group's founder, who went by the online handle Marek, and the cameraman, known as Tomek, made one final attempt to bring attention to the files. In March of 2020, they sent the complete archive of photographs to a journalist at a Polish investigative magazine. The journalist confirmed receipt and expressed interest. 2 weeks later, she told them she had been unable to verify any of the information and her editor had killed the story. She did not respond to subsequent contact attempts. Marek wrote one last post. It appeared on a small Polish-language forum dedicated to Cold War history. It was not a call to action or a plea for help. It was, in his words, a record, something to exist somewhere, in case everything else disappeared. In that post, he described a detail that had not appeared in any of the group's previous publications. It concerned the 47th file. The last one they had photographed before leaving the facility. This file was different from the others. Not in format, it had the same blue-tinted paper, the same red project stamp, the same blank admission and discharge fields. But the photograph was missing. In its place was a small, neat rectangle of adhesive residue, as if a photograph had once been attached and later carefully removed. The name field was blank. The diagnosis codes were blank. The procedure status field read, complete. The severance index was 10.00. The maximum value. The only file in the entire collection to reach it. And the notes section, which in other files contained pages of clinical observations, held a single line of text. Marek translated it himself, and his translation has been corroborated by every Russian speaker who has subsequently reviewed the photograph. It read, "The subject has been successfully integrated into the general population. Monitoring is no longer required." That is the last line of the last file in a locked room in the basement of a facility that does not appear on any map, concerning a patient who has no name, no face, and no history, who underwent a procedure that may have erased everything that made them human, and who was then released into the world. Among us. And monitoring, apparently, was no longer required. Because whatever was done to this person was so complete, so thorough, so irreversible, that there was nothing left to monitor. They would not remember. They would not relapse. They would not exhibit signs of distress or trauma or confusion, because the thing inside them that could experience those states had been severed so cleanly that it would never grow back. They would walk through the world as a perfect facsimile of a person. They would hold conversations, maintain relationships, perform tasks, perhaps even express what appeared to be emotions. And no one, not their colleagues, not their neighbors, not even those closest to them, would ever suspect that behind those eyes, there was nothing. No one. An unbroken, featureless silence where a self had once been. Or perhaps, and this is the thought I cannot stop returning to, perhaps that is not quite right either. Perhaps the severing did not create emptiness. Perhaps it created something else. Something the researchers, with all their clinical precision and ideological certainty, did not fully understand. Perhaps when you remove every trace of identity from a conscious mind, what remains is not nothing but something that has never had a name because it has never existed before. Something that wears human identity the way a hermit crab wears a shell, not as an expression of self but as a tool. A convenience. Something that learns to mimic personhood so perfectly that the performance becomes invisible, even to itself. What would such a being want? Would it want anything? Can something without a self have desires? I don't know. The files don't say. The files only tell us that the procedure worked, that at least one subject was released, and that the people who did this considered the project complete. Marek's final post ends with a question that I will relay to you now, not because I have an answer but because I believe it deserves to be asked. He wrote, "We think of identity as something fundamental. Something that cannot be taken away. We build our entire understanding of human rights, of consciousness, of morality, on the assumption that there is a someone inside each of us who is inviolable. But what if that someone is more fragile than we believe? What if it can be removed, not destroyed, but removed, like a component from a machine, and the machine keeps running? What does that mean for us? What does it mean about what we are?" I have been researching this story for over 2 years. I have spoken to 2 of the original 5 members of Zapomnienie Miejska. I have reviewed the photographs. I have consulted with historians, psychologists, and one former Soviet military physician who agreed to speak with me on the condition that I never identify him in any way. He told me that he had never heard of the severing. He told me that the facility I described did not match any installation he was aware of. He told me that the procedures described in the files were, to his knowledge, impossible. Then he paused, for a long time, and said, "But you have to understand. There were many things that were impossible. And then they were merely classified. And then they were denied. And then everyone who remembered them was dead, and they became impossible again." He asked me not to contact him a second time. The facility in Kaliningrad is still there. Satellite imagery from 2023 shows the buildings largely unchanged. But there are signs of recent activity, tire tracks in the overgrown courtyard, a section of the perimeter wall that appears to have been repaired. Whether this is related to the files or to some entirely mundane purpose, perhaps the site is being redeveloped, perhaps the military is using the land, I cannot say. The filing cabinets are almost certainly still in the basement. Unless they are not. Unless someone has gone back for them. Unless the padlock on that steel door has been replaced with something more permanent. I think about Subject 47, the one with no name and no photograph and a severance index of 10.00. I think about them walking through a city somewhere, Moscow, Kaliningrad, Warsaw, Berlin, anywhere. Buying groceries. Waiting for a bus. Sitting across from someone at a dinner table, nodding at the right moments, laughing at the right jokes, performing the 1,000 small rituals of human connection with flawless, practiced ease. And I think about the people around them. How they would never know. How they could never know. Because the performance is perfect. Because the severing was complete. Because there is no seam, no scar, no tell. Just a person. Just a normal, unremarkable person. Except that sometimes, and this is something I have not been able to verify, something that exists only in Marek's final post and in a single, blurred photograph that may or may not show what he claims it shows, sometimes, in the files marked, complete, in the margins of the clinical notes, in handwriting that does not match the typed text, someone has written a word. A single word, repeated. In Russian, it is. It means, I hear. Not, I hear something. Not, I hear voices. Just, I hear. As if the act of hearing itself, of being a consciousness that receives and processes the world, was remarkable enough to note. As if it was unexpected. As if whatever remained after the severing was surprised to discover that it was still, in some residual and perhaps terrible way, aware. I hear. 2 words that suggest the severing was not as complete as the researchers believed. That somewhere beneath the silence, beneath the flat line of the severance index and the clinical certainty of the project notes, something persisted. Something that could not speak, could not remember, could not identify itself as a self, but could hear. Could receive the world without being able to respond to it. Could experience existence as pure, undifferentiated input with no framework for understanding what it was or why it was happening. Imagine that. Imagine being aware without being anyone. Hearing without comprehension. Feeling without context. An endless, unstructured stream of sensation with no self to organize it into meaning. No past to give it perspective. No future to give it purpose. Just an eternal, formless now. That might be the most frightening thing I have ever considered. Not the emptiness. The presence within the emptiness. The trapped, nameless, faceless awareness that remains after everything else has been cut away. And it is out there. Somewhere. Walking among us. Hearing everything. Understanding nothing. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that keeps me awake, understanding everything, and simply unable to tell us. The files are real. The facility is real. The project happened. I believe this as fully as I am capable of believing anything that I have not witnessed with my own eyes. Something was done to 47 people in a basement in Kaliningrad, and at least one of them was sent back into the world carrying a silence inside them that is deeper than anything most of us will ever know. I do not know what the severing was, fully. I do not know who authorized it or why. I do not know if its methods died with the Soviet Union or if they survived, adapted, found new applications in new contexts under new names. I do not know if Subject 47 is still alive. But I know this, the padlock was on the outside of the door. Someone locked that room from the corridor. Someone walked away. Someone climbed the stairs and left the facility and returned to the surface world, carrying the key to a room full of evidence that 47 people were systematically unmade, and they chose to lock it away rather than destroy it. Which means they considered the possibility that someday, someone might need to open it again. And I cannot stop wondering why.